Okay, I wanted to pick up with the end of the Mongolian Empire and the Yuan Dynasty and take Chinese history through the Ming and Early Qing dynasties. The Ming Dynasty began in 1358 with the overthrow of the hated Mongols who ruled China for about 100 years, largely under the reign of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who created the Mongolian Empire. The Mongolian Empire's reign in China is known as the Yuan Dynasty or the Yuan Dynasty, Y-U-A-N. After the overthrow of the Mongols, we enter a period where we have the last pure Chinese dynasty, which lasted for 300 years. It's considered the last pure Chinese dynasty because the Qing Dynasty, which is the last one that we'll be talking about, is actually the group in charge of the Qing Dynasty are known as the Manchus, and they're from the northern region of Manchuria. Manchuria today includes Beijing, so this ultimately becomes part of modern China, but at this time, the Manchus were a minority, ethnic minority within China. So that's why the Ming Dynasty is considered the last pure dynasty. There was generally an effective government during the Ming, and there was a sharp rise in population and food supply. Here's a map of the maximum area controlled by the Ming, and then the maximum area controlled by the Qing, and then you can also see the Great Wall there in the middle. You can see that the striped lines that are pink and green are the Ming Dynasty. One of the biggest things that the Ming Dynasty did was it reunified the Great Wall that had first been built and unified under Shi Huangdi about 1,500 years prior to this in the Qin Dynasty. So most of what you see of the Great Wall today is left over from and restored from the Ming Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty, however, is where they're going to extend into other regions that include Manchuria, as I mentioned, also part of modern-day Mongolia and Tibet. Economic progress under the Ming was pretty active in the beginning. There was a lot of commercial activity, meaning that they were doing a pretty good amount of trading, mostly along the Silk Roads established by the Mongols. However, the Ming Dynasty focused quite differently than Europe on family and on honor rather than on wealth. Now, as you remember, in Europe, they began to focus more on materialism and a new middle class that made its money through work rather than titles. But in the Ming Dynasty in China, their cultural values are very different. There, the merchants or the businessmen, those making this new money, were seen as socially inferior even though they had money. And there was some commercial contact with the Europeans, which began with the Portuguese. In addition, there was the Ming Dynasty decided to refocus on Confucianism, which does not admire capitalism, and also there was a little emphasis on the accumulation of material goods. China failed to make the leap into the Industrial Revolution, and a big part of that was their failure to explore, as the Europeans did. They also lost their monopoly on many of the goods that were desired by other people in India, the Middle East, and in Europe, including jade, tea, porcelain, gunpowder, and inventions such as the compass. The Ming political system operated a lot like the divine right of kings, and in fact occurred at the same time as the age of absolutism, where most absolute monarchs, kings and queens, claimed that God had ordained or chosen them to lead. In China, they don't practice Christianity, but they have a similar concept called the Mandate of Heaven. And the Mandate of Heaven created a government and a bureaucracy where government was in many parts of the people's lives. They also divided China into 15 provinces in order to govern more effectively, and there was a governor of each province. But rather than money, occupations were still hereditary, almost like a noble system. And so there was certainly a social class system, although it was not tied to religion like it was with the caste system in India. A term that you should be familiar with are eunuchs, and eunuchs were dedicated servants, and it was really a permanent social class where you served a particular person, but also your children were always going to be eunuchs as well. The eunuchs ultimately are going, though, to have a pretty big amount of influence, and they are some of the leaders that ultimately choose not to join the Age of Exploration. Something else that is new in the Ming Dynasty is the creation and the move of the capital city to modern-day Beijing. And they built a royal palace complex known as the Forbidden City, which I'm sure you're familiar with some of the images of the Forbidden City. And as I mentioned, was a complex of palaces, offices, and living quarters. The equivalent in Europe would be like Versailles. So, as they used principles of Confucianism to structure their society, they created an exam system where those examinations were the basis for entry and success in the bureaucracy. And as I mentioned, many people worked within the government to help the government function. Again, based in Confucianism, and it was a way for a tiny minority to gain success through promotion. It also strongly influenced education and the emphasis that society placed on education. But it had a very narrow curriculum. It did not encourage diversity. It did not encourage Eurasian trade, and it did not encourage exploration. It also encouraged conformity and discouraged imagination and individuality. And that's important because you still see some of those cultural undertones in China today. So ultimately, this Ming Dynasty created a cohesive governing class with very few differences in philosophy. As I mentioned at the beginning of the screencast, the Mongols had ruled China, and once they kicked the Mongols out, the Ming Dynasty focused a lot of their money and a lot of their attention and energy on keeping the Mongols out. And so they had raised a huge army that was constantly keeping the Mongols out and maintaining the Great Wall. There were a couple of incursions, but both of those were forced back, and China maintained its rule and its control over its own affairs. They also had to deal with some hostility from the Japanese, which is the islands just to the east of China. And there were some Japanese pirates and smugglers. There was a little bit of cultural and commercial interchange, but basically China believed that it needed very little from the outside. They wanted to reform and they wanted to perfect themselves from the inside out, so they were very exclusive. All right, so let me touch once again on the Ming Dynasty and exploration. The government sponsored some fleets and some exploration escapades to the East Indies and to the African coast. This is where we've talked before about Xing He. There is some evidence that Chinese explorers reached the Pacific coast of North America. But they made no attempts to colonize, they made no attempts to set up a trade network. Even though they had all the tools and actually had an advantage in terms of technology. Remember that the Chinese are the ones who first invented the compass. They also improved ship design and equipment. So while there were a few trading enterprises with the Portuguese and the Dutch, and occasionally with missionaries from Europe, the Portuguese were ultimately expelled from China because, remember, China didn't even really like their own businessmen, much less foreigners who they felt like were coming in and trying to exploit China. In the back of their minds, I believe that the Ming Dynasty was so afraid that they were going to endure another invasion and another foreign government like they had endured with the Portuguese. With the Mongols. Matteo Ricci is probably the most famous European missionary who traveled to China, and he did establish an early Christian presence in China, and he was a Jesuit, which is a type of Christian missionary within the Catholic Church. The Jesuits emerged during the Reformation. So now we have the end of the Ming and the beginning of the Qing Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty began to decline in the 1600s, at the exact same time that Europe was really hitting its stride with the Renaissance, the Reformation, and even the beginnings of the Enlightenment. But also, don't forget the scientific revolution in there as well. Within China, however, there were a lot of peasant rebellions, and the bureaucracy ceased to function in an effective way. So in some ways it was similar to a civil war or a civil revolt. So the Manzhou came in from Manchuria, as I mentioned, and as you saw on the map, Manchuria was the region north of the traditional Ming Dynasty, just north of the Great Wall. And they had a lot of ties to the Chinese and would be similar to maybe in the United States comparing Native Americans with European Americans, with the Native Americans being the Ming and the Europeans being the Qing Dynasty. And so they came in, and while they did have large ties to them, ethnically and religiously and culturally, they were not considered part or purely Chinese. But they ultimately won support from the Mandarin class, and the Mandarin class was the upper class of the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so remember that the Mandarin class was the sort of the bourgeoisie of China. And when the last Ming emperor died without a successor, the Manzhou, this family dynasty, set up and took over power in China. And they established what is still known as the Qing Dynasty or the Qing Government. The transition was relatively peaceful. I think that it was successful in large part because the Manzhou from Manchuria were essentially distant relatives of the Chinese. And so under the Qing Dynasty, China's borders an area reaches its largest size. And they changed the government just a little bit so that it would be filled by two people, one who was purely Chinese and one who was part of the Qing Dynasty. That also helped those in the Ming Dynasty to accept this transition. And at first they were very strong reformers in fixing the government and making China work and the Chinese government work effectively. The two most famous emperors of the Qing Dynasty are Kangxi and Qinglong. And we have another grandfather-grandson duo here, a little bit like Genghis and Kublai Khan. Kangxi ruled at the same time of Louis XIV in France, and he helped to improve waterways. He also was very active in economic policy and stability, because at this point the Chinese had lost almost all of their monopolies on goods that were in heavy demand by other areas, and they had chosen not to really join the scientific revolution or exploration. Qinglong, his grandson, came in after a short stint of Kangxi's son, and he actually treated Korea, which is on the peninsula to the east of China. He treated them as almost like a province or as a colony, and the technical term is a satellite of China. And so although you had these efforts, what you see here is that essentially the Qing Dynasty in China overextends itself, and it tries to get too big, especially when they start going into Korea and they start challenging Japan a little bit. But overall, there was no fundamental break in cultural styles or philosophy.